The phone call came at 7:14 in the morning, and by 7:22, the owner of Callaway and Sons Precision Auto knew he was either about to have the best month of his career or the worst. Vivian Hartwell did not ask questions. She gave instructions. The car would arrive Friday. The engine would be rebuilt. The invoice could be whatever it needed to be. She used the word whatever, the way people use it when they have stopped caring about numbers, because the thing they actually want cannot be bought with a clean round figure. Owen Callaway, who had run that shop for 19 years and had learned to read the temperature of a person's voice the way he read the temperature of an engine, held the phone away from his ear after she hung up and stared at the wall for a moment. Then he called his 7 best mechanics into the front bay and told them a 1967 Shelby GT500 with a $450,000 custom engine was coming in on Friday, and he needed everyone at their best. They all nodded. They all smiled. None of them had any idea what was about to happen. The car arrived on a flatbed at 11 in the morning, on a Friday that felt too warm for November. The driver who brought it said almost nothing. He unloaded it, handed Owen a sealed envelope with documentation, and left before anyone thought to ask him anything. The mechanics gathered around it the way people gather around something they are not sure they should touch. It was a dark navy blue that looked almost black, depending on where the light hit it. The body was immaculate. Someone had taken extraordinary care of the outside of this car for nearly 60 years, which made what was underneath the hood feel even more complicated. Because what was underneath the hood was not a standard engine, not even close. It was a supercharged 427 side oiler that had been modified by a custom builder named Gerald Foss, who had died 11 years ago and taken most of his technical knowledge with him. What remained of his knowledge existed in a water-damaged journal that nobody at Callaway and Sons had ever seen or heard of, sitting in a donated box at a library sale across town. Owen's lead mechanic, a broad-shouldered man named Craig, lifted the hood and stood there in silence for a long moment. Then he exhaled through his nose and said, very quietly, that this was going to take some serious time. That was the last thing Craig said that was even close to optimistic. By the end of the first day, Craig had identified 3 separate problems that he did not know how to solve without documentation from the original builder. He was experienced. He had worked on rare engines before. He had rebuilt things that most mechanics would have walked away from. But this engine had been modified in ways that broke with conventional engineering logic, and the modifications had been made by someone who clearly understood what he was doing, but had done it in a language nobody in the shop could read. The components were not standard. The tolerances were not standard. Even the way the block had been prepared before assembly was not standard. Craig called Owen into the bay at 4:30 in the afternoon and told him, without drama, that he was going to need a few days to figure out the approach. Owen said that was fine. Craig nodded and went home. The second mechanic walked away on day 2. His name was Phil, and he had been working on engines for 23 years. He stood in front of the open hood for most of the morning and made 3 attempts to run a pressure check before the results came back wrong each time, in ways that did not make sense to him. At lunch he told Owen he did not feel comfortable continuing without the original builder's specifications. Owen asked him to stay through the afternoon. Phil said he appreciated the work, but he had a family to think about, and he could not afford to make a mistake on a job this size. He shook Owen's hand and left. 2 more followed before Thursday. No anger, no argument. Just men who had measured the distance between what they knew and what this engine required and decided, honestly, that the distance was too far. Owen did not blame them. He had hired them because they were skilled, not because they were fearless. And there is a difference between those 2 things that most people do not think about until a moment like this one. By the time Craig came back in on Friday morning, he had made some calls. He had talked to 2 engineers who specialized in vintage engine rebuilds, and both of them had said essentially the same thing. Without Gerald Foss's original documentation, working on this engine was not a repair job. It was a guess. A very expensive guess on a very expensive machine that belonged to a woman who did not tolerate errors. Craig found Owen in the office and laid it out plainly. He was not able to do this job responsibly. He did not have the information he needed, and he was not willing to proceed without it. He was not quitting because the job was too hard. He was quitting because the job was, in his professional opinion, currently impossible. Owen sat behind his desk and did not say anything for a while. Craig left the envelope with his notes on the engine on Owen's desk and walked out of the shop without looking back. That left two mechanics. Neither of them had been directly involved with the Hartwell engine, and when Owen pulled them in and explained the situation, both of them agreed to take a look. They spent most of that day going through Craig's notes and making their own assessment of the engine. They were careful, they were methodical, and when they ran the pressure check on the block in the late afternoon, the block cracked. Not from anything they did wrong. The crack was already there, deep in the metal, a stress fracture that had been invisible to everyone who had looked at this engine. It had been there before the car arrived at Callaway and Sons. It had been there before Vivian Hartwell ever made the call to Owen. Someone along the line, at some point in the long history of this car, had either missed it or known about it and said nothing. The two remaining mechanics looked at each other across the engine bay. One of them picked up his jacket off the hook on the wall. The other one found a notepad and wrote 4 sentences on it. He tore the page out and set it on the workbench where Owen would find it. It read, "The block has a stress fracture on the left side. We found it during the pressure check. We did not cause it. Some machines do not want to be fixed." Owen found the note at 5:47 in the evening. He stood in the empty front bay with the note in his hand and the Hartwell car sitting behind him under the fluorescent lights, and he thought about how he was going to make this phone call. He made it from his office with the door closed. Vivian Hartwell picked up on the second ring. Owen told her plainly and without decoration what had happened. 7 mechanics, 7 different points of exit, a hidden stress fracture in the block that her own team had not found before delivery. The engine was still sitting in his shop. Nothing had been damaged beyond what was already damaged when it arrived. There was a silence on the other end of the line that was not the silence of someone processing information. It was the silence of someone who had already processed it and was now deciding what to do with what they felt about it. She asked one question. "Is there anyone left?" Owen thought about saying no. It would have been the simpler answer. But something in him, some instinct that 19 years of running a shop will build into a person whether they want it or not, made him think of the back bay, made him think of the man who came in at 6 in the morning before anyone else arrived. The man who drank bad coffee and did not talk much and had a daughter in the 3rd grade, and a mind that worked differently from anyone Owen had ever hired. He said he would look into it and call her back in the morning. He walked to the back of the shop and stood in the doorway of the back bay for a moment. Marcus Del Rey had already gone home for the day. His workstation was clean. His tools were hung in the exact order he always hung them. On the shelf above his bench there was a photograph of a little girl with a gap-toothed smile, holding a yellow pencil case, and next to the photograph, an old coffee mug with a chip in the handle that Marcus had clearly repaired himself with some kind of dark epoxy that had dried in a thin, careful line. Owen looked at the mug for a moment. Then he turned off the light and went home. He did not sleep well. In the morning, Marcus Del Rey arrived at 6:02. He made his coffee. He sat on the stool at his workbench and read something on his phone for a few minutes. Then Owen came in through the side door, still wearing his jacket, and stood at the entrance to the back bay, and looked at Marcus and said, the way a man says something when he is not sure how it will land, that the Hartwell engine was still sitting in the front bay, if Marcus was interested. Marcus looked up from his phone. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug, the one with the repaired chip, and he looked at Owen for a moment, with an expression that was not easy to name. Then he finished his coffee, set the mug down, and walked to the front bay. Vivian Hartwell had built her company from a single delivery contract into a regional logistics operation, with roots across 4 states, and a payroll that made other CEOs in her industry pay attention when she entered a room. She had done it without a co-founder, without a partner, without anyone standing next to her during the hard years when the company was more debt than asset, and she was signing checks with her eyes closed, hoping they would clear. She was not a person who accepted failure from others. She was also not a person who accepted it from herself, which was a standard that had cost her things she did not talk about. A marriage that ended quietly. A friendship that ended loudly. A relationship with her father that never really ended, because it never really began, which is its own kind of loss, and sometimes the heaviest one. The car had been her father's idea, in the way that things can be someone's idea without them ever saying the actual words. William Hartwell had owned a 1967 Shelby GT500 when Vivian was 7 years old. He drove it on weekends and kept it in the garage with the careful devotion of a man who was easier with machines than with people. He never let Vivian touch it. He never explained anything about it to her. He would stand in the garage with the hood open and talk about the engine with the neighbor, with a friend from work, with practically anyone, and Vivian would stand at the garage door and watch and understand more than anyone gave her credit for. When she was 9, her father sold the car. He needed the money for reasons he did not explain to a 9-year-old. The car was gone in a weekend, and he never mentioned it again, and neither did she, and that was the end of that. Except it was not the end of that. It was never the end of that. She had spent 2 years finding the car. Not her father's actual car, which was long gone into a private collection somewhere she could not trace, but a match. The right year, the right build, the right specifications as close as they could be found, and the engine, the specific configuration that Gerald Foss had built for a collector in the late 1970s, before his reputation became the kind of legend that drives prices into ranges that require multiple commas to write down. She had paid for it the way she paid for everything now, without flinching. She had not told anyone why she wanted it. Not her assistant, not her board, not the one close friend she still had who would have understood. She just wanted it finished. She wanted to stand next to a running engine that sounded the way her memory told her her father's car had sounded on Saturday mornings, when she was small enough that the noise felt enormous. She was not a sentimental person. She would have said that about herself with complete confidence. But sentiment and longing are not always the same thing, and a person can spend their whole life being unsentimental and still carry something heavy in the part of themselves they do not introduce to other people. When Owen called the next morning and told her there was one more person who might be able to help, she said fine. She asked for a name. Owen said, Marcus Del Rey. She wrote it down. She did not know what to expect from a man whose name she had written on the back of a receipt at 7 in the morning. She did not know what any of this was going to amount to. But she had not built what she built by walking away from problems that were still technically open. She told Owen to let him try. And Marcus Del Rey, in the front bay of Callaway & Sons Precision Auto, stood with his hands resting on the edge of the car and looked at the engine that had broken 7 men's confidence and felt something in him go very still and very focused. He had seen this engine before, not in person, in a journal, a water-damaged, spine-cracked, barely legible journal that he had found in a box of donated shop manuals at a library sale 4 years ago and bought for 50 cents because something in the handwriting on the cover made him pick it up. Gerald Foss had written in small, careful print. He had drawn diagrams in the margins. He had written notes to himself in the shorthand of a man who assumed nobody else would ever read what he was writing, which meant he wrote the truth about everything, including the things that could go wrong. Marcus had read the journal twice when he found it. Then he had put it in the glove compartment of his truck and not thought about it again. Not because it was unimportant, because at the time, there was no engine it applied to. Now there was. He went to the truck. He got the journal. He came back. He opened it to the page he needed and read the words he had read 4 years ago and not understood the full weight of until this exact moment. Always relieve the left gallery first. She will crack at 60 psi if you do not. Always left. The stress fracture in the block made sense now. Everything made sense now. He set a timer on his phone. He picked up his first tool. 9 hours. Marcus Del Rey was not the kind of man people wrote stories about. He was the kind of man who made stories possible for other people, by quietly doing things nobody else noticed needed doing. He had grown up in Goldsboro, North Carolina, in a house where the garage was always warm because his grandfather, a man named Earl Del Rey, kept it that way. Earl had worked as a machinist for a small military contractor in the 1960s, doing precision work on prototype components at a time when the industry was still figuring out what precision actually meant. He had hands that moved with the economy of someone who understood that every unnecessary motion was a form of waste, and he had passed that understanding to Marcus before Marcus was old enough to name what he was learning. On Saturday afternoons, Earl would work in the garage and Marcus would sit on an overturned crate and watch. He did not ask many questions. Earl did not offer many explanations. But what passed between them in those hours was not silence. It was something more like a language that does not use words. the kind of teaching that happens through the hands and the eyes and the patience of being present in the same room with someone who knows something important. Marcus had carried that language with him all his life, without always knowing what to do with it. He had come to Callaway and Sons 6 years ago, after a stint at 2 other shops where the work was fine, but something about the place never felt right. Owen had hired him to work the back bay, fixing the problems that came in after the senior mechanics had already taken their first pass. It was not glamorous work. It did not come with the kind of recognition that builds a reputation in an industry where reputation is currency. But Marcus had a daughter to raise alone since his wife left when Amara was 18 months old, and the hours were manageable, and the work was real, and real work had always been enough for him. He had learned early that being underestimated was not a wound unless you let it be. It could just as easily be a room where you worked without interruption. So he worked, quietly, competently, in the back bay where the light was slightly worse, and the coffee maker was slightly older, and the only decoration on the wall was the photograph of Amara, holding a yellow pencil case, and smiling her gap-toothed smile that could rearrange his priorities in about half a second. He thought about her now as he stood at the front of the engine bay and read Gerald Foss's handwriting by the light of a shop lamp he had angled for exactly the right visibility. He thought about the school project she had mentioned at dinner last week, something involving vinegar and baking soda, and a paper volcano that she had strong opinions about. He thought about pickup at 3:45 and dinner before 6, and her bedtime routine that was non-negotiable on school nights, because she needed her sleep, and he had learned that lesson the hard way. He had 9 hours. He picked up a relieving tool and began with the left gallery. The first hour was careful, slow in the way that important things are slow, not because they are difficult, but because they deserve the attention that speed would take away from them. He worked through the stress fracture zone the way Gerald Foss's notes described, applying exactly the pressure the journal specified, and no more. He could feel through the tool when the metal responded the way it should. It was not something he could have explained to someone who had not grown up in Earl Del Rey's garage on Saturday afternoons. It was something you either had in your hands or you did not, and Marcus had it in a way that had never fully found the right stage. By the end of the second hour, the crack had stabilized. The block was breathing. He put his palm flat against the metal the way his grandfather used to do, not to measure anything specific but to listen. And what he heard in the vibration against his skin was that the engine was not broken. It had been handled incorrectly. There is a difference, and it matters. In the third hour, his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Amara. He picked up. She wanted to tell him that her science teacher had said the volcano project could be turned in a day late if the construction was taking extra time. She wanted his opinion on whether she should use the extra day or turn it in on schedule. She had strong feelings on both sides of the argument and needed to talk through them. He sat on a stool at the side of the bay and talked to her for 4 minutes. He told her that turning it in on time was always the better move, unless the extra day would make a meaningful difference in the quality of the work. She thought about this for a moment and said she thought the glitter situation was not yet resolved. He said that was a valid consideration and that she should use the extra day for the glitter. She thanked him in the very serious way she had that made her sound older than 8. He told her he loved her and that he would be at pickup on time. She said she knew and hung up. He set the phone down and went back to the engine. The 4th and 5th hours were where the real problem lived. The prototype carburetor that Gerald Foss had installed was a one-of-one component. There was no replacement for it anywhere, because nothing else had been built to these specifications. The senior mechanics had noted in their reports that it was seized and recommended replacement, but replacement was not possible unless someone was willing to commission a new one, and that was a process that would take months and cost more money than the current invoice already contained. Marcus did not consider replacement. He considered the carburetor. He spent 47 minutes with a dental pick and a small light and a patience that he had inherited from a man who believed that the fastest way through a problem was always the most careful one. He worked at the seized components without force. Force was what broke things that could have been saved. He worked with pressure and timing and a technique that Earl had shown him one afternoon in Goldsboro, on a carburetor from a completely different era, on a completely different kind of engine, a technique that Marcus had filed away in the back of his mind, the way you file away a tool you do not have an immediate use for, but know you will need eventually. The carburetor opened at 4:51 in the afternoon. Not dramatically, not with any sound worth describing. It simply went from closed to open, the way a hand goes from a fist to a flat palm, and Marcus sat back on the stool and exhaled through his nose and felt something in his chest that was close to satisfaction, but quieter. Owen came through at the end of the 6th hour, hands in his jacket pockets, pretending he was just passing through. He stopped at the bay door and looked at what Marcus had done and said, with the careful restraint of a man who did not want to jinx anything, that it was looking like progress. Marcus said it was fine. Owen stood there another moment as if he was going to say something else. Then he seemed to decide against it and kept walking. Marcus drank the last of his coffee, which had been cold since hour 2, and returned to the engine. The 7th hour and the 8th hour were the assembly phase. He worked through it with the kind of focus that makes time behave differently, where an hour can feel like 20 minutes because the attention is so complete that the brain stops tracking time as a separate thing from the work. He followed Gerald Foss's specifications the way a musician follows a score, not blindly but with understanding, making the small adjustments that experience and instinct required without departing from the fundamental logic of what Foss had designed. Foss had been a genuinely brilliant man. That was clear from every page of the journal. He had built this engine to work in a specific way for a specific purpose, and the modifications he had made were not shortcuts. They were solutions to problems that standard engineering had not addressed. The engine was strange because Foss had been building for something beyond what the standard allowed. Working through his notes felt to Marcus like a conversation with someone he had never met but recognized. He thought about that as he worked, about the way knowledge can travel across decades through a piece of paper in a water-damaged journal that ends up in a donated box at a library sale, about the particular chain of chances that had to go exactly as they did for this engine to land in front of the right pair of hands. He did not believe in luck the way some people do, but he believed in paying attention, because paying attention was how you recognized a chance when it arrived. At 6:38 in the evening, he connected the last component and straightened up and stood back from the engine. He did not call Owen over. He did not announce anything. He just checked his work one more time the way his grandfather had always checked his work, starting from the right and moving left, looking for anything that should not be there or anything that should be there and was not. He found nothing wrong. He reached in and turned the engine over. It did not roar. That is the word people use about old muscle engines, and it is the wrong word for what Marcus heard in that moment. What he heard was something more precise than a roar. It was a deep, even, continuous note, the sound of components working in exactly the relationship they had been designed to work in, nothing fighting anything else, everything turning and firing and breathing in the sequence Gerald Foss had intended when he had written his small, careful notes in the margins of a journal nobody was supposed to read. Marcus stood with his hands at his sides and listened to the engine run. He thought about Earl Del Rey, about a Saturday afternoon in Goldsboro, about the way his grandfather had always stood after finishing a job, not with his arms raised or his face bright, but with this same still quality, like a man who had done what he came to do and did not need anything else from the moment. He texted Amara that he was leaving in 10 minutes and would be at pickup on time. Then he wiped his hands on a clean shop cloth, folded it, and set it on the workbench. Owen found him a few minutes later in the back bay, washing his hands at the sink. He said he had heard the engine from his office. He said it sounded good. Marcus said it was fine. Owen stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment, with an expression that had several things in it that he did not seem to know how to arrange into words. Finally, he said he was going to call Ms. Hartwell. Marcus dried his hands, picked up his jacket, picked up the journal. He would come back for his tools in the morning. He had a daughter to pick up. Owen Calloway made the call from his desk, and he chose his words carefully. He told Vivian Hartwell that the engine was done. There was a pause on the line that was long enough for him to consider whether the call had dropped. It had not. She asked him to repeat what he had said. He said it again. The engine was done. Running. No further damage to the block. The stress fracture had been addressed. The carburetor had been restored. The whole assembly had been completed in 9 hours by a mechanic named Marcus Del Rey, who worked out of the back bay and had apparently had the original builder's documentation for the better part of 4 years, without knowing he would ever need it. The silence this time was different from the first one. It was not the silence of disbelief. It was the silence of someone who was rearranging something inside themselves and needed a moment to do it without an audience. She said she would be there at 7. She arrived at 6:47. She drove herself, which Owen noted because most people at her level of the professional world had stopped driving themselves to things some time ago. She came in through the front of the shop wearing a charcoal blazer and dark slacks, and the particular posture of someone who had spent enough years walking into rooms that rooms had learned to adjust, rather than the other way around. Owen met her at the door. He walked her through the shop toward the front bay. The lights were still on. The car was still there, hood closed now, looking exactly as it had when it arrived, which was to say, immaculate, though now, what was inside it matched what was outside. Marcus Del Rey was leaning against the far wall of the bay. He had his jacket on. He was eating a sandwich from a paper bag. He looked up when they came in and gave Vivian Hartwell a nod that was polite without being elaborate. She stopped a few feet from the car and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Marcus. She was not someone who introduced herself. People in her world generally knew who she was before she spoke. But something about this particular moment, about this particular bay with its slightly bad lighting, and its smell of oil and metal, and the very faint sound of Marcus chewing a sandwich, made her say her own name, as if she was not completely sure how it would land. He said his name back, as if it were only fair. She asked him how he had fixed it. He told her about the journal. He explained it the way he would explain a bus route or a repair process, without drama, with only the facts in the order they were needed. Gerald Foss, the library sale, 50 cents. The page about the left gallery, 4 years in a glove compartment. He said all of it plainly, and watched her face as he said it, not to gauge her reaction, but simply because he was paying attention, which was what he always did. She asked him if he had known it would work. He thought about it honestly. He said he had thought it would. He said there was a difference between knowing and thinking, and he had not wanted to claim more certainty than he had. She looked at him for another moment, and then asked the question that was the real question, the one she had been building to since she walked through the door. She asked why he had taken the job when 7 other men had walked away from it. He thought about it for the same amount of time he thought about everything. Not long, not short. The amount of time the question actually required. Because they walked away, he said. It was not a boast. It was not a comment on the 7 men who had left. It was simply the truest answer to the question she had asked. The job was still there. He had something that could help. The combination of those 2 facts had made the decision for him. Vivian Hartwell looked at him in a way that was hard to describe. Something moved across her face that she did not let become an expression. It was the kind of thing that happens to people who have spent long enough being in control that even their face has learned to wait for permission before it shows what it feels. She asked to hear the engine. Marcus finished the last of his sandwich, folded the paper bag, set it on the workbench, walked to the car and reached in and started the engine. The sound filled the bay. Vivian did not move. She stood with her hands at her sides and her head slightly tilted, and her eyes not quite focused on anything visible, which is the posture of someone who is listening to something that is also inside them. Owen stood at the edge of the bay and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would improve on the sound of that engine running in that room. Vivian walked to the car slowly. She put her right hand on the hood. The metal was warm from the engine below it. She left her hand there for a moment that went on longer than most moments do. Marcus stood to one side and let her have it. She was 7 years old again in the way that adults are never entirely done being 7 years old, when the right memory gets close enough to touch. She was standing in a garage doorway watching a man she loved more than she had words for talk about an engine to everyone except her. She was understanding everything he said. She was waiting to be invited closer. The invitation never came. The engine ran. Her hand stayed on the hood. She did not say anything for a long time, and nobody asked her to. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, in the precise and deliberate way that voices are steady when they are being held there by effort, rather than ease. She said she was satisfied with the work. She said the invoice would be paid in full. She said she would add an amount of her own choosing on top of that to reflect what the work had actually been worth. Owen started to say something about the standard rate, but she stopped him with a look that was not unkind. She just stopped him. She reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and took out a pen and the folded invoice Owen had left on the front desk. She wrote a number on the bottom of it. She held it out to Marcus. He looked at it. He did not react in any of the ways people usually react to large numbers. He folded the invoice and put it in the breast pocket of his jacket. Owen noticed the number on his way out and said nothing until she had passed him. Then he exhaled slowly through his mouth, like a man releasing pressure. Vivian buttoned her blazer. She looked at the car one more time. Then she looked at Marcus. "Tell your grandfather he did good work," she said. "He died in 2019, Marcus said. She held his gaze. Her expression had something in it now that she was not holding back. "I know," she said. "Tell him anyway." She walked out of the bay. Owen followed her to the front of the shop. Marcus stayed where he was and listened to the engine run for another minute or two before he turned it off. The silence after it stopped was the kind that has a texture. He stood in it for a moment. Then he turned off the bay light and walked out to his truck. It was 7:18 in the evening. He had exactly 12 minutes to get to the after-school program before Amara started looking for him through the window. He drove. 3 weeks later, the front bay at Callaway & Sons looked different and the same in the way that places look when one thing has changed and everything around it is still exactly as it was. Marcus Delray was at the front bench now. Owen had moved him the week after the Hartwell job without making a big event of it. Just showed up one morning and said the front bay needed someone consistent, and Marcus should take it. Marcus had moved his tools and his coffee maker, and the photograph of Amara, and the mug with the repaired chip. The front bay had slightly better light. He was not sure it made a difference. The work came in the same as always. Engines and transmissions and the small complicated problems that people bring to a shop when they have already tried everything else. Marcus solved them the same way he had always solved them, starting with what the machine was telling him, and working backward from there, until he found the place where the telling had begun. 2 shops had called Owen asking about the mechanic who rebuilt the Hartwell engine. Word traveled the way it did in trade industries, not through announcements or press releases, but through the conversations that happen at parts counters and in shop doorways, and over the phone between people who trust each other's professional opinions. Owen had given them Marcus's name. He had not inflated anything about it. He had just said Marcus was there, and that he was good at what he did, which was the plainest possible description of a thing that was not entirely plain at all. One of the 7 men who had left the job called on a Tuesday. His name was Phil, and he had been working on engines for 23 years, and the call had the specific awkward texture of a call that someone made after thinking about it for 2 weeks before dialing. He said he had heard the engine was finished. He said that was good news. Then he said something about how the stress fracture had been a factor that nobody could have predicted, and how the documentation situation had made the job essentially impossible for anyone without access to the original builder's notes, and how he stood by his decision to step back from a job where the risk of causing further damage was significant. Marcus listened to all of this. Then he said, "Maybe." Phil said he hoped there were no hard feelings. Marcus said there were not. The call ended. Marcus put the phone down and returned to the engine he was working on, which was a straightforward valve job on a pickup truck that belonged to a retired teacher named George, who had been coming to Callaway & Sons since before Marcus started working there. George always brought coffee from the place 3 blocks over and set it on the workbench without comment and did not hover. Marcus appreciated both of these qualities. He thought about Phil's call while he worked, not with anger, which had never been his default response to being underestimated or overlooked, more with a kind of quiet acknowledgement that people made the choices they were capable of making at the time they were faced with them, and that was all there was to say about it. The 7 men who had left were not bad mechanics. They were honest ones. They had encountered a problem they did not have the means to solve, and they had said so. That was not nothing. What Marcus had was simply different. Not better in any absolute sense. Different in the specific way that a key is different from a lock, where the difference is everything because of what it opens. Amara came into the shop on the following Saturday with the science project under her arm, the paper volcano with the glitter situation resolved to her satisfaction, which had required a second trip to the craft store, and a heated internal debate that she had narrated to Marcus over dinner on Thursday night. She set the project on the corner of his workbench with great care, and climbed up on the stool and told him in detail about how the presentation had gone. She had received the highest mark in the class. Her teacher had said, the glitter represented an unexpected creative choice. Amara had opinions about whether glitter could be unexpected at this point in human history, but she had kept them to herself during the presentation and saved them for Marcus. He listened to all of her opinions. He asked 2 follow-up questions. She was satisfied. She looked around the front bay with the evaluating eye of a child who notices when things are different from how they were before. She said it was bigger out here. He said it was about the same size, but the light was better. She said she thought the photograph looked good on this wall. He said he thought so too. She picked up the mug with the repaired chip and examined the line of dark epoxy along the handle, where Marcus had fixed it the previous winter, when it had fallen off the shelf in the back bay and cracked. She asked him why he had fixed it instead of getting a new one. Because it still works, he said. She thought about this with the seriousness she brought to most things. Then she nodded and set the mug back down. Vivian Hartwell did not publicize the story. She did not post about it or give interviews about it, or make Marcus into a public moment that he had not asked to be part of. She was not that kind of person, and beyond that, she understood instinctively that the story was not hers to tell. It was his, and he did not seem particularly interested in telling it, and she respected that with the ease of someone who had learned the value of keeping certain things close. She did one thing. She sent a single email to a journalist named Carol Webb, who wrote about skilled trades and manufacturing for a publication that took both subjects seriously. The subject line of the email was short. It said, "There is a man in Raleigh you should talk to." The body of the email was 4 sentences, which described the situation plainly and gave Marcus's name and the name of the shop. She did not editorialize. She did not attach adjectives to his abilities or suggest how Carol should frame the story. She just opened the door and let it be Carol's decision whether to walk through. Carol walked through. She called the shop on a Wednesday and spoke to Owen, who passed the phone to Marcus, who talked to her for 11 minutes and answered her questions with the same directness he brought to everything. She wrote the piece. It ran 2 weeks later. It was not a large feature. It was not on the front page of anything, but it was accurate, and it was specific, and it was the kind of piece that gets shared between people in an industry who recognize the thing being described because they have seen it, or wanted to see it, or been on the wrong side of it. The journal went to the vocational school in Wayne County. Marcus had made 1 photocopy first, of the page with the left gallery note, and he had it framed and hung on the wall of the front bay, next to the photograph of Amara. The framed page and the photograph were the only 2 things on the wall. They were all the wall needed. Gerald Foss's original journal arrived at the school on a Friday afternoon in a padded envelope with no return address, which was not exactly accurate but was how Marcus preferred it. The librarian there was a woman named Dorothy, who had been managing the school's technical reference collection for 14 years and who recognized immediately what she was holding. She called the shop to find out who had sent it. Owen took the call and said he would pass the message along. He told Marcus someone named Dorothy from the vocational school had called and wanted to say thank you. Marcus said that was kind of her. Owen waited to see if Marcus had anything else to add. He did not. Amara's presentation, it turned out, was not about the volcano. She had told Marcus it was about the science project, because at 8 years old, the full thing felt too large to explain at the dinner table, on a Thursday night, when they both had things to do. But the actual assignment had been broader than a single experiment. The teacher had asked the class to present on someone who had taught them something important, and to explain what they had learned and how it had changed the way they thought about something. Amara had chosen her father. She had stood at the front of her class with a piece of paper she had written her notes on in her careful, slightly oversized handwriting, and she had talked about him for 3 minutes. She talked about the garage in Goldsboro where he had grown up, which she knew about from the stories he told when she asked him questions about where he came from. She talked about the fact that he fixed things nobody else could fix, and that when she had asked him once why he was good at it, he had said it was because someone took the time to show him. She talked about the mug with the repaired chip. Her teacher, a woman named Mrs. Ann Briggs who had been teaching for 16 years and had heard a great many student presentations, sat quietly through this one, and did not interrupt or redirect or ask the clarifying questions she sometimes asked when a child was going off in an interesting direction. She just listened. At the end, she asked Amara what the most important thing was that her dad had taught her. Amara thought about it for a moment. Not a long moment. The amount of time the question actually required. She said her dad had taught her that the most important thing about a hard problem was not to walk away from it just because other people did. Mrs. Briggs wrote that down. She wrote it down because it was the kind of thing you write down when you hear it, not because you need to remember it for later, but because the act of writing it down is a way of honoring the fact that something true just entered the room. When Marcus picked Amara up that afternoon, she told him about the presentation. She told him what she had said. She did not dramatize it or wait for his reaction with the performed excitement of a child who expects to be praised. She told him the way she told him most things, plainly, because it had happened and he should know. He drove for a moment without saying anything. They passed the hardware store on Elm, and the dry cleaner with the red awning, and the corner where the man always sold boiled peanuts on weekends. The afternoon was cooling off, and the light was long and golden in the specific way of late afternoons in November when the year has started to wind itself down. He asked her what she thought about what she had said. She said she thought it was true. He said he thought so too. They drove the rest of the way home in the comfortable quiet of two people who do not need to fill every moment, which is one of the rarer things you can have with another person, and one of the things Marcus valued most about his daughter, who had come into the world with a particular quality of presence that he could not entirely take credit for, but felt grateful for, every single day. He made dinner. She set the table without being asked. They ate and talked about the weekend and the glitter situation, and a book she was reading that she had opinions about. And when the dishes were done and her homework was checked and her bedtime routine was complete, Marcus sat in the kitchen with the last of his coffee and looked at the wall where he had hung the framing of Foss's journal page. Always relieve the left gallery first. It was not a profound sentence on its own. It was a technical instruction from a careful man to himself, written in the shorthand of someone who was thinking out loud on paper at the end of a long day. But what it had become, in the chain of events that had moved it from Foss's hand to a library sale, to Marcus's glove compartment, to the front bay of Callaway & Sons, was something more than a technical instruction. It was evidence of a principle that Marcus had understood since he was a child, sitting on an overturned crate in Earl Delray's garage on a Saturday afternoon. The knowledge that matters most is the kind that moves between people. It is not always recognized at the moment of transfer. It does not always arrive with a label or an occasion. Sometimes it arrives in a handshake, and sometimes it arrives in a 50-cent journal at a library sale, and sometimes it arrives in an afternoon in a garage, where a man does not say much but keeps showing up and letting you watch. What you do with it depends entirely on whether you have been paying attention. Marcus had been paying attention for 38 years. He finished his coffee, rinsed the mug, set it on the counter with the repaired chip facing out the way he always did, for no reason he had ever examined closely, and no reason he felt the need to examine now. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to check on Amara, who was already asleep with her book open on her chest and her lamp still on. He closed the book, marked the page, turned off the lamp, pulled the blanket up to her shoulder. He stood in her doorway for a moment the way he stood in his grandfather's garage when he was small, absorbing a quiet that had something valuable in it that he could not yet name but knew enough to stay close to. Then he went to bed. In the morning he would be at the shop by 6. The coffee would be bad, the work would be real, and whatever came through the door, whatever problem arrived with its complications and its history, and its hidden stress fractures that everyone else had already given up on, he would be there. He always was.